Hello and welcome to tonight's British Napoleonic Bicentenary Trust event, which we've called Contemplations on Exile. We're joined tonight by three fantastic speakers, each of whom will explore a different perspective on St. Helena's history of exile and isolation. Firstly, we will hear from Dr. Daniel Yong, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Education at York University in Toronto. Dan was born and raised on St. Helena and is a founding member of the island's Heritage Society. His recent work in ethnographic film is variously engaged with the South Atlantic world and the St. Helena diaspora. Dan will make the opening presentation, offering 4 takes on the question of exile and the identity of St. Helena, looking in the shadow of Napoleon at the island's other exiles, as well as how the sentiments of exile may be discerned in the memory of St. Helena and its people. Following all the presentations, Dan will chair a discussion with the other 2 speakers tonight, Hlonipa Makina and Will Atkins. Dr. Hlonipa Makina received her PhD from the University of Cape Town in 2005. She is an associate professor and researcher at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research in Johannesburg, and her articles have been widely published, including in the Journal of Natal and Zulu History, the Journal of Religion in Africa, and the Journal of Southern African Studies. Hlonipa will introduce the story of King Dinuzulu, the last king of the Zulu people, who was formally recognized as such by Britain, but who was captured by the British after leading a Zulu army against the British annexation of the coastal plains of Zululand. King Dinuzulu was exiled to St. Helena for 7 years, and Hlonipa will explore this fascinating history through the writing of Magima Magwaza Fuze, who was also sent to St. Helena as a tutor to King Dinuzulu and his family. And finally, Will Atkins is the author of The Immeasurable World, A Desert Journey, and winner of the Stanford Dolman Travel Writing Award. He's a regular contributor to The Guardian, Granta, The New York Times, and Harper's, and is currently working on a book about places of political exile, including St. Helena, which will be published later this year. Will is going to offer us a reflection on the wider significance of exile and its effects on the human spirit, including homesickness, as it was understood in the 19th century, and the unique experience of exile, including, of course, that of Napoleon, King Dinuzulu, and a lesser-known St. Helenan exile described in Francis Godwin's The Man in the Moon. So, before I hand over to Dan, let me just thank tonight's speakers in advance, and also to you for your interest in the work of the British Napoleonic Bicentenary Trust. As always, tonight's content is provided for free, so I would just ask, if you enjoy the presentations and the discussion, to please make a donation on our website at www.napoleon200.org. On that note, over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for inviting me to do this, and I will reveal how I responded to your invitation at the end of my initial contemplations. And can I say I'm really particularly happy to be in the company of my good friend Hlonipa from Wits University and Will from Suffolk. And I really look forward to their contribution to this conversation. So I'm going to, in a moment, share my screen with you, which means you'll see less of me, and that might be a good thing. Well, let me start by sharing the screen now. Oops. Okay, so here are the 4 points that I want to make in this little presentation. I want to provide a brief moment of reflection on St. Helena as a place for the reflection and contemplations on war. Secondly, I will speak about contemplations on the concept of solitude. Thirdly, I will critique the notion of solitude by making reference to an identity of Saint Helena as enmeshed in a network of broad network of belongings that transgress the globe. And finally, I will say something about exile and memory when I attempt to reverse the logic of exile. So I begin with this slide. After his death, the Bonapartists in France romanticized about what they saw as the charismatic, strongman qualities associated with Napoleon Bonaparte. And this slide embodies the kinds of images of grandeur and triumphalism associated with the great man and celebrated by the Bonapartists. The revival of Bonapartism was also the context for the digging up of Napoleon's remains from his burial place in Seine Valley, St. Helena, in 1840. That's 19 years after his death, for return for burial in France. Here is the path to the empty tomb, and here we arrive at the tomb. The Bonapartist movement was also the context for Turner's famous painting, War, the Exile, and the Limpet. In this image, gone are the sentiments of triumphalism and grandeur. The great man is now a diminished figure of contemplation, standing in the background. The bright red colors, also in the background, might suggest a beautiful sunset. But for Turner, the red represented something more somber. This is a sea of blood. Turner's statement on the horrors of war. These anti-war sentiments made the painting particularly controversial when it was first exhibited in 1842, 2 years after the return of Napoleon's remains. The landscape in Turner's painting might not mirror the landscape of St. Helena, but then it is a painting, not a photograph. But there is reference to the sea, albeit as blood, to rocks and limpets and a diminished man. Turner's painting is a sublime imagery of a distant place of exile. And alongside of Luke Bennett's photographs of the path and the empty tomb, the island is evoked as a small place provoking contemplations on large worldly issues. In this case, contemplations on war. This is one of the legacies of Napoleon's exile, illustrated here in my juxtaposing of the exile and the rock limpet with the image of the empty tomb. So my first take on exile is one of the legacies of Napoleon's time on St. Helena. And this imagery, this legacy, I would suggest might be one that is worth holding on to. And for my second take on exile, I draw on Abdul Assam's superbly rich and detailed book, The Other Exile. Assam tells the story of St. Helena's first inhabitant, Fernando Lopez. Lopez, history recalls, was one of the Portuguese seafarers who in the 16th century sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, following plans and hopes of conquering India or parts thereof for the Portuguese crown. But during the exhibition, Lopez changed sides and fought on the other side, the side of the enemy, who were largely Muslims. Not only did he fight against his own countrymen, he also converted to Islam. When recaptured by his fellow countrymen, Lopez was tortured, mutilated, maimed, put on a ship, and returned home to Portugal. But en route, Lopez chose exile over the inevitable shame and humiliation of returning home. he jumped ship at St. Helena, hid among the endemic trees, opting for a life of solitude, resisting offers of forgiveness should he wish to return home to Portugal. For some, Lopez was the original Robinson Crusoe. Now, I find Assam's contemplation on Lopez's thinking as a Catholic and Muslim man during his time of solitude really deeply moving. But it is the opening line of Assam's book that captures the most persisting identity of St. Helena as cut off, as isolation par excellence. He writes, as many have before him and many after him, solitude has its coordinates. At exactly latitude 15.25 degrees, 55 minutes south, longitude 5.25 degrees, 45 minutes southwest, 1,143 miles west of Angola, 1,800 miles east of Brazil, a remote rock lies in an endless ocean. The coordinates are confirmed visually. There it is, a remote rock, cut off, isolated by the endless sea. This is the enduring imagery of the place of exile. But in my third take on the identity of the place of exile, I challenge this representation by attempting to think with the sea. Like all islands, St. Helena's relationship to the sea is paradoxical. The endless ocean cuts the island off, as Assam notes, but the ocean is also what connects the island to elsewhere. If we only think with the island's coordinates, it is cut off, it is out there. But if we think with the sea and with the paradox, the island and the ocean becomes one. Thinking with the sea takes us to before history. Since the beginning of time, the island has been continuously washed by the South Atlantic currents that move anti-clockwise and swept by the southeast trade winds. These winds and currents enabled the discovery of the island by Juan de Nuevo Castella in 1502, and later the arrival of the ship from which Lopez escaped the shore. Over the subsequent years and centuries, thousands of ships called at this place that for some represented paradise. The result of these maritime moves is that St. Helena became the South Atlantic node, the oceanic roadhouse, in an expansive network of connections and movements linking east and west and north and south. Enmeshed in and constituted by these dense networks and the movements of peoples and goods they suggest, the identity of the island is far from cut off. And can I just say that this is a beautiful map, one of my favorite maps, though it doesn't do justice to the full extent of these connections because it focuses only on the British trade routes. Imagine these routes being at least doubled in another map. So exiles and non-exiles are all implicated in something far greater than the 47 square mile island. And thinking with the sea is also thinking about the multiple journeys to and from the island, the place of exile, by sea. The movements were movements of freedom as well as movements of constraint and banishment. And the latter reminds us of other exiles. Prince Dennis Zulu, war prisoners of the Anglo-Boer War, Zulu freedom fighters of the Bambata Rebellion against the British imposition of the poll tax in Natal, Bahraini prisoners, and non-exiles alike. All are implicated in these networks that transcend the local, thereby challenging the notion of isolation. Now, I know in a moment, Hlonipa and James will expand on these networks and circulations that go in multiple directions, especially in their specific focus on Prince Denizulu. But before that, I have a fourth take on exile and belonging. My fourth take reverses the logic of exile as banishment to consider departures from as opposed to arrivals at the island. Exile in this fourth move is detached from notions of banishment, inspired by scholars such as the Palestinian writer Edward Said. Exile is double-edged. It is about the unbearable rifts of displacement from home and the insurmountable sadness of departures. It is about looking back to the island from the outside rather than as the banished looking out from the inside. Said suggests that these conditions of exile can also be a source of creativity and enrichment. And so within the spirit of Said's notion of creativity and enrichment, I'm going to finish here now with a few selected snapshots from some of my own efforts in registering this other side of the double-edged nature of exile. In 1949, 100 men left St. Helena to work on farms in Oxfordshire, England. Archival materials revealed some anxiety regarding the racial mix and therefore the fit of these men for the English countryside. 50 years later, here is Edward Leo, one of those men walking me around his garden in Hampshire. Everything you see here is from St. Helena, he tells me. Even the loquat tree was grown from a pip from St. Helena. Exile here is literally and figuratively about uprooting and rerouting. 50 years after arriving in England, showing me around his little garden in Devon, Bill Johns, another one of these men, tells me, you know, my heart belongs to St. Helena, but my body belongs here in England. In 1907, 100 men left St. Helena to work in the copper mines of Concordia in Namaqualand in the Northern Cape of South Africa. And here I'm being shown around the house built by one of these men, one Harry Peters. His grandson, in this picture, Lionel, tells me that his grandmother decreed before her death, nobody must touch this house because it was built more than 100 years ago. He also tells me that his grandfather wanted to save some money so that he could take his family to St. Helena, a wish he was unable to fulfill. Harry's house now stands at the edge of Concordia, now as memory of St. Helena. Snapshot 3. Here is the late jazz vocalist Satima Benjamin performing at Sweet Rhythm, a jazz club in Manhattan, New York. Satima's grandmother left St. Helena in the latter part of the 19th century to seek employment and to settle in Cape Town. Referring to her grandmother's beginnings, Satima tells me that her voice is so unusual, you know, because it comes from far, far, far away. I think of the currents, the trade winds, and the sounds of the sea carrying her voice. And finally, here is a gravestone in a cemetery in Port Elizabeth, one of many such gravestones that can be found around South Africa, registering St. Helena as a place of identity for the dead, as well as a place of identification for the living. I was taken to this grave by the now aging grandchildren of the buried. They talked about their long-held wish to visit the birthplace of their grandparents in the South Atlantic. I discern in their talk around the grave and the journey to it, the sentiments of attachment and detachment, belonging in South Africa while longing for contact with St. Helena. There is nostalgia, the sense of loss, the sense of hope. In short, I hear the familiar sentiments that resonate with Edward Said's notion of exile without the banishment. Now, I'm trying to, oh, okay. So these 4 takes on exile and identity of Saint Helena, Contemplations on the place of the empty tomb, the place of isolation and solitude, the connected and the interconnected, and finally, the place of memory, began with Napoleon. But when James asked me if I would contribute to the series, I indicated to him that I would do so, but by gesturing to other histories, including what we might call histories from below, histories of ordinary people that are overshadowed by images of the history of the great man. And so that is why my contemplations finish in a cemetery in Port Elizabeth, rather than the tomb of the reburied Napoleon at Les Invalides in Paris. And I'm going to leave it at that point and hand the floor, the cyber floor, to my good friend, Hlonipa Mokoma.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you to James Bramble for the invitation, and I look forward to the audience participation. Unfortunately, the audience, we know that you are there, but we are speaking into the ether, as it were, or into the wires. So thank you for being there. And the way that I will do my presentation is, obviously there's going to be some slides. I will read a little bit of my paper, just so you can get a feel for my writing style and the way that I present Dinizulu. And then I will just speak to the images, because the text that I will read will appear on the screen. So I'm about to start sharing. And so here goes. The story of Dinizulu's time on the island of St. Helena is the story of a kingdom quartered and maimed by imperialism. His father, Cetshwayo, was actually the first Zulu king to be exiled from his kingdom and his people. In the aftermath of the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, Cetshwayo was arrested and deported to Cape Town, where he lived until 1883, when he was restored not to his kingdom, but to an attenuated chiefdom that had been demarcated by the British with the help of the mendacious Secretary of Native Affairs, Theophilus Shepstone. If the story started and ended here, then it would be a simple story. Colonial depredation, loss of power, restoration of power, colonization, etc. However, it is the presence of John William Colenso and his daughter, Harriet Colenso, that makes the story a little bit more complicated. And so you can see the 3 figures in Dinizulu's life. His father, Cetshwayo, whom you see there on, it should be on the left-hand side of your screen. And then on the top right-hand corner is an illustration of the Lord Bishop of Natal, John William Colenso. And then on the bottom right corner is Harriet Colenso. The presence of John William Colenso and his daughter complicates the story and makes it into what I like to call a minority report. When John William Colenso arrived in Natal in 1854, he had no idea that in time, he would become an advocate for Zulu autonomy. He came to South Africa as Lord Bishop of Natal and as a missionary to the African population of Natal. And if any of you know anything about the politics of the Anglican Church, that title, Lord Bishop of Natal, was used once and once only for John William Colenso and was never used again. By the 1870s, however, it was clear to him that the settlers who attended his church services on Sunday mornings were not the Christians he imagined them to be, but populists and jingoists who were looking for an excuse to attack the independent Zulu kingdom. His position and the title of Lord Bishop permitted him direct access to the Queen and to the House of Lords, and he used these two instruments to represent Cetshwayo's cause. After his death in 1884, his daughter Harriet Colenso took up her father's mantle and fought in the same cause. Neither of the Colenzos could, however, have accomplished their advocacy work without the assistance of their Zulu converts, specifically Magema Fuze. I will come back to this slide. That is Magema Fuze, who was educated in Colenso's mission school, and in 1922 published one of the most inventive and radical history books titled Abantu Abamnyama Lapho Bavela Ngakhona, The Black People and Whence They Came, which was published in 1979 as a translation. Fuze's book and his published articles in newspapers owe some of their intellectual vigor and energy to the time he spent on St. Helena. As a literate and educated Zulu speaker, Magema Fuze was sent to the island on the insistence of Harriet Colenso, who didn't approve of the government-appointed teacher and interpreter. Magema Magwaza Fuze was born around 1840 and died in 1922, and he was born in the colony of Natal. When Colenso arrived in 1854, Fuze became one of the first in a cohort that would later be called the class of 1856. He was educated at Colenso's mission school, Egukhanyeni, and Colenso trained him as a printer. It is this latter artisanal skill that made him indispensable to the Colenso family, as the father and then the daughters became embroiled in one or other colonial controversy. For those versed in the politics of the Anglican Church, it is common knowledge that Colenso was excommunicated from the church after publishing his exegesis titled The Pentateuch and the Book of Joshua Critically Examined. And if you are interested in church politics, he's still excommunicated. The Anglican Church absolutely refuses to rehabilitate him. His convert, Magema Fuze, played a seminal role not only in Colenso's re-examination of biblical doctrine, but in the physical printing of the books that Colenso was publishing on biblical doctrine. Once the biblical and church controversies had died down, the political ones began. The first of these political controversies involved the Amahlubi chief Langa Libalele, who in 1873 defied the orders of a magistrate to disarm his young men and was summoned to Pietermaritzburg to meet with Theophilus Shepstone. When Langa Libalele didn't respond to the summons, Shepstone sent a military force to crush Langa Libalele and his people. Colenso responded by conducting his own investigation into the affair and then publishing his findings. This first foray into Zulu and Natal politics gave Colenso a bitter foretaste of what many African rulers faced on a daily basis, an arbitrary, punitive, and vindictive exercise of paternalistic power. Thus, when Cetshwayo started feeling pressure from the Boers and the British, he appealed to Colenso since he had seen the power of his advocacy on behalf of Langa Libalele. That is how, in brief, the Colenso family became embroiled in Zulu affairs. In all these moments, the constant presence of Colenso's African amanuenses made the difference between failure and success, truth and lies. Dini Zulu then was born into this world of a kingdom in flux, caught between the territorial ambitions of the British and Boers, and also battling to keep the kingdom from fracturing from within. I'm just going to quickly give you a geographical and spatial orientation for those of you who don't know where the Zulu kingdom was. So this map shows you where the Zulu kingdom was. And if you watch this black line, let's just use this pen quickly. This black line here represents the border that existed between the Zulu kingdom and the colony of Natal. So to the north, where the Zulu kingdom was essentially an independent kingdom, which had nothing to do with the colony to the south. And so the colonists in the colony of Natal essentially wanted that portion of the southeast coast, and the Zulus were trying to protect their autonomy. And as you can see already to the north, you already have the Boer Republic of the Transvaal. So that is the geographical and spatial context. And so my own work has been on Make Mafuze and mostly his journalism, because from the moment that he sort of qualified as a printer in the 1850s, he started publishing. So there are articles, for example, in 1878, he traveled to visit the Zulu King Cetshwayo, and Colenso had that published in Macmillan magazine. So even travel writing was Make Mafuze's foray. So he was an article writer, he wrote series in newspapers, and this is the book that he published, The Black People and Whence They Came, one of the most misunderstood books in the history of South African letters, precisely because most people pick up the book expecting to find a history book, and instead they actually find a sort of philosophical treatise on where the Zulu people come from and how we are connected to Egypt and how all African cultures are connected to Egypt. And most people just find it a bit too far out. And so they abandon the book without realizing that the author of the book actually had published many more things than what could be captured. This is my own book on Make Mafuze, if you'd like to read it. It came out in 2011 and was published by UKZN Press. But this is Dinizulu Cetshwayo. He was caught between these territorial ambitions. As a young man, he witnessed the exile of his father, and he also watched the civil war break out in Zululand. Now, again, it's very complicated to explain the politics, but essentially, one of the biggest enemies of the Zulu nobility was actually their own relative, uZibhebhu kaMandlakazi, who was a distant and adopted cousin, who in a sense felt that he should have more power within the Zulu nobility. And so what happened in brief to Dinizulu was that once his father was dead, he actually didn't rule immediately. A regent ruled in his place. And then when he came of age, he became king. But he was faced basically with this enemy, Zibhebhu on the one side, the Boers on the other side, who essentially were bargaining because the Boers had been involved in the succession of Zulu kings since his great-grandfather, Mpande. And the Boers wanted to be involved in another succession to the Zulu throne, in putting up their own king and essentially fighting on behalf of their king. And then the British wanted a kind of federation. And again, it's very complicated, but essentially the British imagined South Africa to be the whole of the region. And as you could see from the map, the Zulu kingdom was standing in the way of sort of a federation of Southern Africa. And the British imagined that South Africa would include countries all the way to like what today we would call Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Angola, etc., etc. So the Zulu kingdom was standing in the way. And so when Dinizulu arrives on the island of St. Helena, after having basically fought his relative Zibhebhu, defeated him once, and then the British go chasing after him, they capture him, they take him to the island of St. Helena. The most surprising thing is that as with his father, he actually was treated as a celebrity. So most of you, when you hear the word exile, you imagine that when he arrived there, it was a sorry affair. Actually, everyone was excited to see the Zulu king. And in fact, Make Mafuze even writes about how there was a black regiment that landed on St. Helena, and all they wanted to see was the Zulu king, Dinizulu. So I'm going to give you in a moment a few excerpts from Make Mafuze's writing while he was on St. Helena. So the Zulu exiles were treated as celebrities, and they used their celebrity status to actually pressure the British government for certain privileges. So for example, you'll see, if you remember the image, maybe I'll go back to it at the end. Dinizulu's uncles, Undabugo and Tingane, have got the traditional Zulu isiqoqo. So that is not something that you can just make yourself. Somebody has to make it. So they would refuse to be seen in public until their isiqoqo were fixed. So the British government had to get a special person and send the person to St. Helena just to fix the hair of the of his uncles. So this was the bargaining power that they often used to use, the fact that they were celebrities, to sort of extract privileges from the colonial government. So I'm going to talk about Make Mafuze's he essentially spent 1 year on St. Helena. He arrived there in 1896, as far as we know. He didn't keep a diary of his time in St. Helena, but we know because in the Black People and Whence They Came, he actually writes a bit about what he did on St. Helena. So for example, he broke his ankle, he was in hospital on St. Helena. And just to tell you how difficult it is to do research, a certain historian, when I asked him about Make Mafuze and his time on St. Helena, the historian looked at me and said, you know that he was an alcoholic. That's why he fell and he broke his ankle. So there were also these kind of seditious stories about how the exiles were drinking on St. Helena. But that's an example of the kinds of things you hear when you are trying to excavate a history. So one of the things that happened to Make Mafuze was that he soon enough realized that simply by being associated with Dinizulu and his uncles, his letters were being opened and read by the governor of St. Helena. And so he writes this letter. He says, I may also inform your excellency that this is the first time I ever received this bad treatment. The English government is a Christian one and is always expected to treat everyone with justice. And I thought this was forbidden by all English law, to explore one's heart without proper reason, except when one was found dead suddenly. And for this cause, I pray your excellency to advise me what to do to escape this trouble. I am Sir Makema Magwaza. So he was writing this in response essentially to the colonial censorship of his letters. He even changed his address and got another person living on the island of St. Helena to receive his letters because he wanted to stop his letters from being read by the British government. The other person who became instrumental to Makema's life on St. Helena is Alice Werner, who was one of the founding faculty members of the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in London. Alice Werner was a friend of Harriet Colenso, and through Harriet, she met Make Mafuze. They spent a lot of time comparing notes on the history of the Zulu kings. Addressing her as Nkosazana, Fuze related to her how he had been sharing her stories with Dinizulu's uncles. And here I'm going to read in Zulu, in isiZulu, and I'm also going to read in English. Omunye umntwana wenkosi yakwaZulu ndabuko uzwile kimi ngimxoxela indaba ngawe yaleso sizwe esimnyama awuhlezi phakathi kwaso nangezincwadi lezo wawuzinge ungitsheleka zona ukuba ngifunde ngesikhathi leso engangigula ngaso kithi ekukhanyeni. Ngimlandisile futhi ukuthi abanye bakulezo zizwe bakhuluma ngolimi lwakwaZulu impela, ngisho labo ababiza uNkulunkulu ngokuthi mulungu, nabanye abalulimi lwabo lusondele kolwethu. End of isiZulu. English. One of the other princes of the Zulu king, Undabuko, has heard me talk about you and the story of that black nation that you lived amongst, and about the books you used to lend me to read while I was sick back at home at Egukanyen. I told him that some of these people from these nations speak the language of the Zulu people truly, and I mean those that call God Mulungu, and all those whose language is close to ours. End of English. Although he had interlocutors while living on the island, Make Mafuze still felt what Will Atkins is going to talk about, which is nostalgia. For the present, I am living at the island as an orphan who has lost his father and mother before being able to help himself. I was allowed by the Natal government to come to assist the Zulu chiefs by writing their letters and to teach the children and to stay with the chiefs so long as convenient, as long as they were kept exiles on this island. And now I am there, it goes the other way, as you will see in the enclosed letter to Miss Colenso. In his old age, Make Mafuze would return time and again to his St. Helena years and write to the readers of Ilanga Lasenatali about the reign of the Zulu kings, as well as about the Pan-Africanist ideas inspired by his conversations on the island. In 1921, he specifically published a series of articles titled Dinizulu, Ukuzalwa Nokubakho Kwakhe, Dinizulu, His Birth and Existence, perhaps as a summary of Fuze's interpretation of the effects of war on the Zulu people. It is apt to cite his description of how even the language that Zulus used to speak about who was an enemy and who was a loyalist changed. And again here, I want to give you a flavor of the Zulu language that Make Mafuze used, and then my own English translation. How? Kwathi nigilili nje. Izwe lonke lakwaZulu lonakala impela. Basebebizana ngokuthi amambuka laba asebehlubuke umbuso wakwaZulu. Abashokobezi laba abasabambele enkosini. Kwaba kubi nje kwaqhamuka amacala amabi okubulalana. Kwafa muntu, kwafa mlungu, kwathula kwathi khwishiliwe. Alas, there was scattering. The entire land of the Zulu was truly despoiled. They started calling each other the traitors if they had deserted Zulu rule, the rebels if they were still attached to the king. It was all very bad since there appeared many wicked crimes of murder. Blacks died, whites died in a continuous din, continuous violent commotion. So Make Mafuze's words reverberate to us living today in 2020 and thinking about what it means to write from exile, but also what it means to be an isiZulu writer living on an island in the 1890s. So I want to conclude by a little thought from Nadine Gordimer, who some of you may have read her book, The Essential Gesture. And when she writes, she says, whether a writer is black or white in South Africa, the essential gesture by which he enters the brotherhood of man, which is the only definition of society that has a permanent validity, is a revolutionary gesture. And I'd like to suggest that Make Mafuze's time on St. Helena was exactly such a revolutionary gesture, because right even before his death in 1922, he still remembered the Pan-Africanist sensation and sentiments that he had learned while on the island. But he also thought of the island as part of Africa, part of the African story. And in his writing on uDinizulu, he never forgot to mention the fact that it was he who, while on the island, kept communicating to the Zulu people back in South Africa, reminding them that their king is alive. And that was the part of it that I would call the revolutionary gesture, was keeping the life of Dinizulu alive even while he was on the island. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hlonipha. I'm going to move quickly now to Will. Thank you.
And thank you. I want to thank the Bicentenary Trust, as well as Dan, for inviting me to be involved in this event. For anyone interested in St. Helena, I can't recommend highly enough Dan's wonderful films. For anyone interested in the intellectual history of South Africa, I highly recommend Hlonipha's wonderful book about Make Mafuze. I'm thinking about these connections between what you, Dan, call this small place provoking contemplations on large worldly issues, and what Hlonipha, you describe as this kingdom, a wonderful description of this kingdom quartered and maimed by imperialism. I want to offer this evening a sort of extension of what Dan and Hlonipha have reflected on, zooming out from our island of exile to take a broader view of the history and geographies of exile in its broadest forms. So taking us from St. Helena to Romania to another island with a French exile connection, before we zoom back down to this beautiful speck of rock in the South Atlantic that's brought us all here tonight. In 1838, about 5 years before he painted that wonderful painting that Dan showed us, The Exile and the Rock Limpet, Turner painted another extraordinary sunset. I'm just going to share my screen here, or perhaps it's a sunrise. And it depicts a scene very far from St. Helena, as you can see, very far in space and in time. This is ancient Rome. It shows, amidst this vast diffusion of colour, the great poet Ovid being sent into exile in around 8 AD to a place at the very edge of the Roman Empire, the Black Sea port of Tomis, modern-day Constanța in Romania. Here's a detail, and you can see the figure of Ovid being dragged away in what looks like kind of 19th century night clothes with perhaps his wife beseeching at his side. And I wanted to mention Ovid who ended his days in exile without ever seeing his beloved Rome ever again. Because I think of him as a key figure in this whole history of political exile. I'm not going to go into the slightly mysterious reasons for Ovid's exile, but suffice to say, it was Ovid who first articulated in the extraordinary poems he wrote from the Black Sea, the idea of exile as a kind of splitting in two, a kind of cleaving of the body from the soul. And for Ovid, the moment when that cleaving occurs is during his winter voyage from Rome to the Black Sea, 1,000 miles, 3 months, down the length of Italy, across the Adriatic and the Aegean to modern day Turkey and finally modern day Romania. It's hard for us to imagine, I think, just what such a voyage meant for someone of Ovid's era. It was as if he was being banished to Mars. Here is a later, slightly later painting, Delacroix's Ovid among the Scythians, 1859. We see here Ovid after that long journey on the edge of a Black Sea among an unfamiliar people. Ovid wrote that he felt himself ripped asunder as his ship carried him further and further away from home. As though I'd lost a limb, a part of me seemed wrenched from my body, he writes. And he goes on to compare his fate to that of the warlord Metus, who in Virgil's Aeneid is bound to 2 chariots and torn apart as punishment for betraying Rome. I've spent the last 4 years or so on the trail of various political exiles around the world, and I found this metaphor of exile as dismemberment is one that recurs again and again. Napoleon himself, ironically, was a believer in the power of exile, both as punishment and as a means of colonization. The best penitentiary system, he said, would be one which purged the old world through populating the new, purged the old world through populating the new. And his nephew, Louis Napoleon, during his reign, initiated a resurgence of banishment as a political weapon in France, with political enemies sent to French colonies in Algeria, in Guyana, and in New Caledonia, particularly in the wake, as it happens, of the suppression of the radical socialist government known as the Paris Commune in 1871, which began 150 years ago this week. And it was among the writings of those exiles, especially those sent to New Caledonia, France's colony in the South Pacific, that I read about the concept of nostalgia. And nostalgia not in the modern sense of rose-tinted kind of sentimental longing for the past, but rather as a particular set of symptoms, an illness associated with exile, associated with displacement. And here we can see some of the Paris communards having just arrived on New Caledonia, having travelled literally from the other side of the world. And for its sufferers, this syndrome of nostalgia, it was clear, which was created by the condition of exile, the condition of displacement. It was something that could be lethal. It was as if the removal of the body from its rightful coordinates, from a place we might think of as home, could kill you as surely as if you'd been teleported to a planet without oxygen. The history of nostalgia in this very specific sense can be traced back to the work of a 17th century medic named Johannes Hofer. And Hofer describes in his dissertation on the subject the case of a student from Bern who had gone to Basel to study. And he writes, suffering from sadness for considerable time, he finally fell victim to the disease, i.e. to nostalgia. Since the young man appeared to be dying, Hofer goes on, it was decided to return him to his home. He was scarcely some few miles from our city when all the symptoms abated and he was restored to his whole sane itself. Here's the frontispiece of Hoffer's dissertation on nostalgia or homesickness. And mark that phrase restored to his whole sane self. It was Hoffer who coined the word nostalgia, in fact, from the ancient Greek nostos, a homeward journey of the kind made by Odysseus, and the combining form algos or algios, denoting pain. Ovid in Exile spoke of that kind of pain. And if we look again at Turner's picture of Napoleon, this is a close-up, gazing out to sea, gazing into the island itself, gazing at us, gazing into himself, I think we can imagine that he is familiar with some of those symptoms of nostalgia too. So nostalgia, not merely regret, but a profound, agonized longing for the homeland, which manifests physically and psychologically. So we know that Louis Napoleon, nephew of the great exile, champion of exile as a political tool, was soon to find himself in exile himself, in the home of political refugees at the time, London. And it was in 1879 that his son, 23-year-old Eugene Louis Napoleon, having persuaded the British to let him fight in the Anglo-Zulu War, lost his life. Lost his life very far from any kind of place that he might consider home. And this brings me, of course, to Dinizulu Kasitwayo, exiled to St. Helena with his uncle, from that kingdom quartered and maimed by imperialism, in Lonipa's wonderful words. And my reason for visiting St. Helena a couple of years ago, and one of the subjects of this book I'm working on. And it brings me specifically to Dinizulu's journey into exile, from Durban, aboard the steamship, the Anglian, down the dangerous east coast of Southern Africa, round the Cape, and finally to St. Helena, an 18-day voyage. And here we can see the steamship, the Anglian. And very little is known about the journey itself, but we know that as well as his uncles in Dabuko and Chingana, Dinizulu was accompanied by a retinue of no fewer than 11, including his uncle's wives, various attendants and interpreters, and most particularly, Dinizulu was not married, his two female companions, Umkasalomo and Uzilizale, daughters of high-ranking Zulu chiefs. In a letter to his mother, written just after they've got to the island, Dinizulu writes that he was very much alarmed at the illness of the girls during the voyage. Umkasalomo vomited a great deal, he writes, while Uzilizale's illness commenced by her nose bleeding profusely, just as if she had been stabbed. And she had also taken a violent headache. And while both women recovered, I've often thought about Umkasalomo and Uzilizale on the SS Anglian, and then on St. Helena, removed from their homeland, put to sea, a sea they probably had never set eyes on before, let alone sailed upon. And it seems to me that vomiting, we can put that down to seasickness. But a bleeding nose, these violent headaches seem to suggest a more profound kind of disturbance to me. And I'm drawn again, of course, to think about that old idea of nostalgia and its peculiar set of symptoms, and to Ovid's idea of being torn in two as he was carried into exile some 2,000 years earlier. This is a wonderful image that Lonipa has already shown us of Dinizulu's arrival on the island on the 25th of February, 1890, originally appeared in the Illustrated London News. You can see his entourage, you can see the curious onlookers of Jamestown. And however uncertain he and his group may have been about the future, however fearful they may have been about what they would find on St. Helena, I think it's also certain that they would have felt a certain relief at finally of making land. Before closing, and I'm conscious we're running pretty short of time, I want to share with you briefly another image. And this one depicts an even less well-known St. Helena exile. It's a happier picture. It's one of escape to mirror Turner's images of banishment. One of the earliest descriptions of St. Helena in print appears in 1638 in a book attributed to one Domingo Gonzalez. And it suggests that even by then, by 1638, the island had become a kind of byword for remoteness. Gonzalez tells us he had been set down on its shores, having fallen sick en route from the East Indies to his native Spain. And among the birds he describes on the island was a certain kind of swan, which he calls a ganser, from Spanish goose, presumably. And he explains, and I quote, "I took some 30 to 40 of young ones of them and bred them up by hand, partly for my recreation, partly as having in my head some rudiments of that device which afterwards I put into practice. I began to craft in my head how I might do to join a number of them together in bearing of some great burden, which if I could bring to pass, I might enable a man to fly. To fly, it turns out, to the moon, for that is where in Gonzalez's account his tamed birds carry him, because the story constitutes the opening pages of The Man on the Moon, a work of kind of proto-science fiction, which in fact appears to have been written by one Francis Godwin, the Bishop of Llandaff, who didn't visit St. Helena any more than he visited outer space. And with that image of liberation, of transcendence, and with Dinizulu and his companions very much in my mind, I'm going to pass the virtual microphone back to my friend Dan over there in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Absolutely lovely on the part of both of you, and thank you for your contribution. Our questions have been thin, but the one question that has been posed, and of course, given that the impetus for this series is Napoleon, are you, either of you, aware of Mufwezi making any reference to Napoleon on the island, or whether he had any relationship at all to the places that Napoleon visited and lived?
Well, perhaps I can speak to this briefly. Of course, during my visit, Napoleon was a deep and long and dark shadow, and I think the same can be said of Dinizulu's time on the island. Certainly, he was profoundly conscious of that history. Harriet Colenso, who Lonipa has mentioned, Dinizulu's great champion and friend, daughter of John Colenso, Dinizulu's father's great champion and friend, visited the island on 3 occasions. Yes. Largely in the course of trying to comfort her friends in exile, but also in the hopes of arranging their release. And on the last occasion, there is a record of Harriet, who was there for I think 3 or 4 weeks, taking a ride on a horse with Dinizulu up to Napoleon's one-time residence at Longwood. So yes, the answer is he certainly was aware of that history, and we know that he visited the house itself at least once.
Lonipa?
Yes, and I think one of the other ways in which the Zulus were very much aware of this very long history of exile is the way that they chose to dress. So one of the things that most visitors were disappointed by, both when Cetshwayo was in exile and when Dinizulu was in exile, is that they would come expecting to find a savage Zulu king, and they would find these black gentlemen wearing top hats and long coats and pea coats and fully dressed in the English style, because I think this is what people expected. And so the way in which the Zulus presented themselves to the public was also in some ways curated in order to match that kind of kingly image, which I think had been set by Napoleon and other rulers who had been exiled or taken. So they didn't want to look like quote unquote savage kings from Africa. They wanted to look like monarchs, equal to any other monarch in Europe. And I think that's also one of the ways in which they tried to match or even outdo the Napoleonic period on St. Helena. And as Will points out, Harriet, I don't know if I can, we didn't really speak about the image. Let me just quickly perhaps show you that in that picture, she is in the center, so of the image when the Zulu exiles have their picture taken. So just a quick revisit of that picture. So this is Harriet Kalenzo in the middle of the photograph. And so even the way that everyone is positioned in the photograph, it was really meant to appeal to the British public that this was a king like Napoleon, and that he deserves no less than what Napoleon or any other king deserved. And so I think from a sartorial perspective, that's what I'm trying to position or to point out, is that from a sartorial perspective, the Zulu exiles understood that they had to present themselves as a kingly entourage rather than as just sort of rebels against British rule.
Well, thank you, James. I'm cognizant of the time. It is 2 minutes after 3 here.
Thanks, Dan. I had one
which
question.
Means it is 2 minutes after something else over there. I want to thank both my fellow presenters for an incredibly rich account of exile, and this final reference linking it to the theme of Napoleon, I think, was the cherry on the cake.
Thanks very much, Dan. Firstly, apologies to anyone who struggled to join the stream at the start. I believe there were some technical difficulties, so apologies for that. We will try and get the recording of tonight's event up on the website, and hopefully people can watch the entire thing online that way if they did miss some of the introduction. I hope everyone agrees those were 3 fascinating presentations that reflect the very diverse history of St. Helena, which includes many, many more stories than just the story of Napoleon, as fascinating as that story is. If you've been following us for some time, you'll know that those stories are very much the stories, the history that we want to tell. Our main project is to renovate Toby's Cottage, which is a building on the island which housed slaves, one of whom met, conversed with, built a rapport with Napoleon. And that building, Toby's Cottage, very much embodies what the British Napoleonic Bicentenary Trust is, in that it is directly related to Napoleon, but it's also a window on the little known stories of the island's people, including the enslaved people on the island. If you'd like to see a 3D scan of Toby's Cottage, it's on our website, www.napoleon200.org. Please do, as I say, consider making a donation to that renovation work. We need to raise an additional £50,000 to deliver that, so any contributions appreciated. And if you have any questions about tonight, about Toby's Cottage, or about making a contribution, please do email me at james@napoleon200.org. On that note, I just say thank you very much to everyone, both our speakers and to you for joining, and a very good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.